There is a moment in every real spiritual awakening that feels like nothing so much as light, nothing like peace, nothing like the enlightenment you were promised. It feels like a loss. You lose certainty, you lose people, you lose identity, you lose the version of God you thought you understood, you lose the self you've spent your entire life constructing and protecting. And this is the part nobody talks about. The spiritual teachers, the Instagram quotes, the transformation stories, they jump from darkness to light, from suffering to enlightenment, as if there's no excruciating middle ground. But according to Carl Jung, awakening does not begin with enlightenment. It begins with disillusionment. It begins when the ego, the carefully constructed identity you've built to survive, to be acceptable, to feel safe, starts to crack. And that cracking feels like death. If you're in the middle of a spiritual awakening that feels more like falling apart than coming together, if you're experiencing the loss nobody warned you about, subscribe to Empire of the Mind. We explore the real psychology of transformation, the uncomfortable truths of spiritual development. Hit that subscribe button. You're not alone in this. 1. Individuation. The journey nobody warned you about. Jung called this process individuation, and the term sounds clinical, abstract, but what it describes is anything but. Individuation is the journey of becoming whole, of integrating all the parts of yourself, not just the acceptable ones, not just the spiritual ones, but all of them. But here's what nobody tells you. Wholeness is not comfortable. It is not peaceful. It does not feel like arriving. It feels like dismantling everything you thought you were. Because to become whole, you must first confront what Jung called the shadow, the parts of yourself you've denied, rejected, repressed, or projected onto others. The anger you've always called not me, the selfishness you've judged in everyone else, the darkness you've spent your life running from, the needs you've learned to be ashamed of, the desires you've condemned as unspiritual. All of it lives in your shadow, and spiritual awakening forces you to meet it. For empaths, this is especially painful. Why? Because empaths often build their entire identity around being needed, around being kind, around being the good one, the selfless one, the one who understands, the one who sacrifices. And that identity feels spiritual. It feels like love. It feels like you're doing what you're supposed to do. But when awakening begins, you realize something deeply unsettling. Some of your goodness was fear, fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of not being loved if you weren't useful. Some of your patience was self-abandonment, not spiritual maturity, but an inability to honor your own needs or set boundaries. Some of your love was a need for validation, a desperate attempt to prove your worth by being indispensable to others. And that realization feels like losing yourself. Because if you're not the patient one, the understanding one, the endlessly giving one, who are you? If your goodness was contaminated with fear and need, was any of it real? If your identity was built on a false foundation, what's left when that foundation crumbles? This is the grief of awakening, and it's excruciating. 2. The narcissist as mirror. Why the loss feels so sharp. And if you've been entangled with a narcissistic personality, the loss feels even sharper. Because here's what Jung understood about these dynamics. The narcissist mirrors back a version of you that your ego desperately wants to believe is real. They show you the rescuer, the healer, the indispensable one, the only person who truly understands them, the special one who can save them. And for the empath, this feels like purpose, like calling, like proof that your sensitivity, your depth, your capacity to love has meaning. The narcissist makes you feel seen not for who you actually are, but for the role you're performing. And if you've been starving for recognition, for validation, for proof that you matter, that feels like love, but it's not love. It's a transaction. It's the ego of the empath and the ego of the narcissist locked in a dance that serves neither person's actual growth. When that dynamic collapses, when the narcissist discards you, when you finally see the manipulation, when the mirror breaks, it feels like you've lost your purpose, your identity, your proof that you matter. But here's the paradox Jung understood, the paradox that can save you if you're willing to see it. You are not losing yourself. You are losing your false self. The version of you that needed to be needed, that was ego, not soul. The version of you that measured worth by usefulness, that was wounding, not love. The version of you that performed goodness to earn belonging, that was a survival strategy, not an authentic self. And now that the false self is dying, and it should die, because underneath it is something real, something grounded, something that doesn't require validation from anyone, including narcissists, to know its worth. 3. Spiritual awakening as grief. What you're actually mourning. Spiritual awakening feels like grief because you are grieving illusions. The illusion that love requires suffering, that real love means tolerating abuse, accepting breadcrumbs, giving endlessly without receiving. The illusion that being chosen defines your worth, that you only matter if someone, especially someone damaged or powerful, selects you as special. The illusion that God only exists in comfort, that spiritual development means peace, certainty, and constant emotional elevation. Jung believed that true encounter with the divine happens in what he called the numinous experience, a confrontation with something larger than the ego, something that utterly transcends your control and understanding. But that confrontation is destabilizing. It's terrifying. It strips away everything you thought you knew, because you cannot meet God while clinging to ego identity. You cannot encounter the sacred while protecting your false self. You cannot experience genuine transcendence while demanding that reality conform to your expectations. So first, something must fall apart. This is why awakening often follows betrayal, heartbreak, rejection, or profound spiritual confusion. Not because God is punishing you, not because you failed, but because the psyche is being forced inward. You can no longer rely on external validation. You can no longer maintain the performance. You can no longer avoid yourself. You must descend. And this descent, what mystics across traditions call the night of the soul, feels like abandonment. It feels like God has withdrawn. It feels like you're more lost than you've ever been. But psychologically, Jung would say, it is integration. You're not being abandoned. You're being forced to confront everything you've been avoiding. You're being invited to reclaim everything you've projected onto others. You begin to see your shadow not as something evil to be destroyed, but as disowned parts of yourself that need to be integrated. You begin to reclaim your projections, realizing that the narcissist wasn't your destiny, wasn't your soulmate, wasn't your purpose. They were your mirror, reflecting the parts of yourself you needed to see. And when the mirror breaks, when the relationship ends, when the dynamic collapses, you stand alone, but closer to your authentic self than you've ever been. 4. The danger of avoiding the descent. Jung warned that people who avoid this descent, who refuse the night, who bypass the grief, who rush to positive thinking without doing the shadow work, remain spiritually superficial. They cling to rigid beliefs because flexibility would require questioning themselves. They project evil outward because acknowledging their own darkness would shatter their self-image. They never question their own shadow because maintaining the illusion of being the good one feels safer than becoming whole. And they remain stuck, spiritually stagnant, psychologically fragmented. They might look spiritual. They might use all the right language. They might perform all the right practices. But there's no depth, no integration, no real transformation. Because real transformation requires you to go through the death, not around it. But the empath who awakens, the one who doesn't bypass, who doesn't spiritualize their avoidance, awakens differently. They stop blaming the narcissist. Not because the narcissist wasn't harmful, they were, but because blame keeps you externally focused, keeps you stuck in victim consciousness, keeps you from seeing your own part in the dynamic. They stop rescuing others. Not because compassion disappears, but because they finally understand that you can't save anyone from themselves, and trying to do so is ego, not love. They stop performing goodness for validation, not because they become cruel, but because they no longer need external proof of their worth. They're learning to be good because it's aligned with their values, not because it earns love. And in that stillness, in that cessation of performing and rescuing and blaming, something quieter emerges. Not a dramatic revelation, not emotional fireworks, not the enlightenment you see in Instagram posts, but grounded awareness. A deep, quiet knowing that doesn't depend on external circumstances or validation or proof. 5. Where God is actually found. You begin to understand that God is not found in chaos, not found in the dramatic highs and lows of toxic relationships, not found in the adrenaline of being needed or the validation of being chosen. God is not found in ego validation, not in the narcissist's occasional crumbs of affirmation, not in performing spirituality for an audience, not in maintaining an image of enlightenment. God is found in wholeness. And wholeness requires you to integrate both light and darkness, both your capacity for love and your capacity for selfishness, both your spiritual aspirations and your human needs, both your compassion and your anger. This is what Jung meant by the integration of opposites. You can't become whole by identifying only with light and projecting all darkness outward. You can't become spiritually mature by claiming to be beyond anger, beyond need, beyond human messiness. You become whole by acknowledging all of it, by bringing your shadow into consciousness, by accepting that you contain multitudes, and that's not a flaw, that's what makes you human. And paradoxically, this integration, this acceptance of your full humanity, is what allows genuine encounter with the divine, because you're no longer performing, you're no longer pretending, you're no longer maintaining a spiritual image. You're just real, grounded, whole, and in that groundedness, you discover that God was never in the performance. God was waiting in the authenticity you were too afraid to embody. 6. The other side of grief. So if your awakening feels like loss, if you're grieving relationships, certainty, identity, even your previous understanding of God, understand this. You are shedding skin, not losing yourself, but losing what was never truly you in the first place. You are dissolving false attachments, not being abandoned, but releasing what was keeping you from wholeness. You are becoming internally anchored, no longer dependent on external validation, no longer performing for approval, no longer building your identity on being needed. The loss is temporary, the grief is real, but it's not permanent. But the integration is permanent. Once you've seen your shadow, you can't unsee it. Once you've reclaimed your projections, you can't unknow them. Once you've discovered your authentic self beneath the performance, you can't go back to pretending. And on the other side of grief is not the old you, the performing, rescuing, externally validated you. It is the real you, grounded, whole, authentic, internally anchored, not perfect, not enlightened in the Instagram sense, not beyond all struggle, but real. And that reality, that groundedness, that integration, that's where God lives. Not in the chaos you escaped, not in the performance you maintained, not in the false self you've been grieving, but in the wholeness you're becoming. Spiritual awakening feels like a loss because something is dying. Your false self, your illusions, your ego's carefully constructed defenses. But what's dying needed to die, and what's being born, your authentic self, your integrated wholeness, your grounded awareness, is worth the grief. So trust the process. Even when it feels like falling apart, you're actually coming together. Even when it feels like losing yourself, you're actually finding yourself. Even when it feels like God has abandoned you, you're actually closer to a genuine encounter with the divine than you've ever been. Because God is not found in performance. God is found in presence. And presence requires you to be real, to be whole, to be grounded, not to be perfect. The loss you're experiencing is making room for something more real than you've ever known. If this message speaks to where you are right now, if you're in the middle of a spiritual awakening that feels more like death than rebirth, subscribe to Empire of the Mind. We're creating a community that honors the real process of transformation, not the Instagram version. Join us. Hit that subscribe button. You belong here. Until next time, may you trust the grief, honor the loss, and know that on the other side is not the old you, it's the real you, finally coming home. Because that's where awakening actually lives.